This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for building your brand and growing your business online. Stand out with a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything. Your products, content you create, and even your time. A core memory I believe everyone has is getting rage baited while wearing your favorite camo clothing item. When a classmate would pretend you're invisible, even though the camo you were wearing clearly was never intended for the lunchroom. Camouflage is one of the most well-known and worn patterns in fashion today. And whether you've worn it because you like the brand Bape or in an ethical cane type way, or because you actually hunt or fish, well, you've probably worn camo at least once. How did it become so popular in our culture today? What is the history of camo? How did it develop? And how did it cross over from pretty niche military and hunting usage to being one of the most popular patterns in fashion today? If you don't know me, my name is Karsten Kraning. I'm a clothing designer. I've been covering clothing history for the past 6 or so years here on YouTube, as well as designing clothes and being really in the world of technical design and performance wear. So it's safe to say I know a thing or two about clothing development and clothing history. So today I want to run you through the history of camo, not only from a historical lens, as well as why it has such a chokehold on our culture. When it comes to actual historical record of our first real written history examples of camouflage, we come across 4th century Roman record keeper Vegetus, who describes how during the Gallic Wars, Romans would disguise their scouting ships and paint them blue to blend them into the ocean. This would be the very first written example of camo in a military usage. But it would be a pretty rare occurrence, because basically when it came to warfare in both the Western and Eastern world, there was a pretty universal concept that you should be highly visible towards the enemy. What ended up happening was there weren't really many uses of camo at all. Instead, for most of human history, military uniforms had pretty bright colors. Basically, war was kind of fought as these head-on-head battles, where whoever was the strongest and most strategically inept would win, and that was seen as honorable. To use camo or to be sneaky in this way, basically seen as an honorless taboo in war. That is until we get to the birth of the rifle. With the birth of the rifle and other firearms, it became clear that the strongest person would not win. Instead, it was whoever had the best gun, the best technology. And all of a sudden, militaries caught on that if the way you win a battle is with the best aim, you might not want to be wearing bright colors. The British were famous for years for wearing these brightly red-colored uniforms. However, in the 1800s, the British began to experiment with green-colored uniforms and other foliage-adjacent colored uniforms. It became clear with the high loss of casualties that these bright-colored uniforms weren't super adept to the environments and the fighting styles that had become apparent with the rise of rifles. And by the mid-1800s, most military powers around the world had switched their uniforms from a bright color to beige, brown, khaki, dark green. When the Great War or World War I broke out, there was still one country that was holding on to the brightly colored uniform concept, and that of course was the French. The French started World War I with these uniforms that had a bright blue jacket and bright red pants. And the French loved their uniforms because of course the French loved their uniforms, and it also led to mass casualties. France, like no other country, experienced terrible mass casualties, especially at the beginning of World War I, probably because it had something to do with those brightly colored pants. Losses were so terrible and devastating that it really convinced France that they needed to get better at blending in with their environment. And so the French actually started the very first camouflage military unit. And the word camouflage that we use today is a French word. The French hired a famous painter, Lucien Victor Garand de Scaevola, to lead the French army's military camouflage unit. And with Lucien at the helm and leading this initiative, we get the first examples that we refer to as camouflage. Lucien and his camouflage unit were able to really heavily apply these concepts to military machinery and equipment, which could easily be painted to disguise itself. But it was more difficult to bring their concepts of camouflage and the patterns and designs they were making to uniforms at the time. This was because the technology to produce textile patterns really wasn't there, especially with producing these complex kind of experimental ideas. By the 1930s, textile development technology was able to start bringing camouflage patterns into real garments and uniforms. The first military to have a camouflage pattern in their uniforms was the Italian military, who would develop telo mimetico, which literally translates to camouflage cloth, would eventually become the base and precursor for the most popular camouflage pattern in the world, Woodland Camo pattern. But the Italians weren't the only ones to develop a camouflage pattern during World War II. Most notably also were the Germans. The first era of camouflage pattern that the Germans developed was called Splinter, and it had these polygon aspects that were very inspired by the French designs of World War I. They eventually developed a better pattern of camouflage called Flectarn. Both Flectarn and the Woodland pattern developed by the Italians are what we call disruptive camos. What disruptive camos do is they purposely disfigure the outline of the wearer. They confuse the eye so that they can't tell where the person begins and where the foliage begins. Disruptive camos aren't meant to look exactly like their background. Instead, it means to confuse the eye, sort of like an optical illusion. However, disruptive camo has a few downsides. First, disruptive camo becomes highly ineffective when the colors of the terrain don't match the colors of the camo. So there needs to be multiple colors for different terrains and actually for different seasons as well, which makes it hard for it to be mass produced when it can quickly become ineffective just moving from summer to autumn. The other huge disadvantage of disruptive camo is that at certain distance, depending on the size of the shapes, the camo can quickly become ineffective. Americans also developed their own pattern of camo, though it wouldn't be seen until 1942, which was called frog skin, which you will not believe it is based off of, yes, frog skin. While camo was really only used by specialized units during World War II, its value was immediately seen and it was highly effective. Those three families of camouflage which were developed in World War II also kind of became the basis for most modern camos as we know it, with Woodland developed by the Italians becoming the most popular, Flectarn also having a huge amount of countries creating their own variations of that, and while frog skin was also quite good and saw a lot of usage, even the US military would go over to a Woodland variant eventually. And so for most of the 20th century, you see most countries using different variations of these two main camo families. There are a few other camo families that were developed during this time that were used in very specialized environments. A great example of this is tiger stripe, which was used during the Vietnam War. But for the most part, 90% of militaries would stick with some variant of Woodland or Flectarn. There really wouldn't be very many changes or development in camo technology, at least in a military context. But when it comes to the civilian hunting sphere, there would actually be a huge amount of evolution in camouflage technology. When hunters who had used camouflage in their military experience would end up wanting to take the concept for hunting. During the 70s and 80s, many civilian clothing manufacturers made camos specifically for hunting. And while these patterns started very similar to the disruptive camos that military used, they eventually kind of moved out of the disruptive camo sphere. Out of these hunting brands, the camo style known as mimicry or background matching was developed. Mimicry or background matching is different from disruptive camo because while disruptive camo tries to distract the eyes, mimicry uses direct imagery such as foliage, sticks, leaves, bark, and has the wearer directly blend into the environment. And it's a completely different style of tricking the eye. While this is a huge leap in camouflage technology, it isn't actually adopted by many militaries in any widespread or significant way. And that's because mimicry needs to be A, very hyper-specific to the environment you're in, and B, the wearer needs to be stagnant for it to be really effective. Realtree and Mossy Oak are two companies that developed really popular hunting camos out of this era. Militaries, especially during the second half of the 19th century, were interested in seeing if they could find a universal camo. And it's costly for militaries to have to create all these variants of a uniform to be effective. And so militaries are pumping a lot of research into this idea of creating a universal camo, one that's effective in all environments. And this is where the concept of digi-camo would come from. Digi-camo, which stands for digital camo and is sometimes also referred to as multi-scaled camo, that was made possible by computers and advanced design software. The general principle of digi-camo is to use these computer-generated pixels as its base, which are then used and organized with different colors to exercise something called scale invariance. Again, one of the big problems with Woodland camo and a lot of its predecessors is they are effective only at a certain ideal range or scale. And hypothetically, the way that digi-camo was supposed to be created would make it more effective at a wider range of distances. Many militaries invested in it and slowly changed their camos from their traditional woodland disruptive camos. And the thought was they would be more universal and more versatile in a wider variety of environments. The idea was that digi-camo was so much more effective that instead of a military having to have 5 variants of woodland camos, they could have 1 or 2 variants of a digi-camo. And it was put into practice by the US military when they developed their universal camouflage pattern. This was a digi-camo that used tan, gray, and a sage green. And the thought was that it was so neutral, yet the pattern was so effective because it used these mathematical concepts, that it could basically be used in any environment effectively. However, like I said, digi-camo is based on theory. And when it was implemented by the US military, it ended up getting a lot of backlash and controversy. And the general consensus by the US military after years of having it in action was that it was indeed ineffective, especially compared to more traditional disruptive camos. And so currently now the US military in 2019 shifted to a different version or a newer version of a traditional woodland disruptive camo. And while digi-camo basically was adopted by militaries all across the world, it's now being seen as generally less effective than more traditional disruptive camos, and there's been significantly less usage since the 2000s. While most militaries shift back actually and use more traditional camos, that doesn't mean camo technology still isn't evolving today. There have been a lot of advancements in more what we would call hyper-specific camos. What's really interesting about a lot of these more newly developed camos for hyper-specific usages is they'll employ both concepts used in mimicry as well as disruptive camos. A great example of this is Cryptek, that combine the shapes and concepts that we would find in mimicry-based camos, but also have some of the concepts that we would see in disruption-based camos. Cryptek has been continually reviewed by the Department of Defense, though it has not been put into military service as of recording this video. It is really popular with civilians and sees widespread use amongst hunters. Similarly to Cryptek, there's also a hunting brand called Sitka, which also develops these very unique camo pattern. Like Cryptek, a lot of these Sitka patterns combine both principles of mimicry and disruptive camo to make these hybrids. Each camo is meant for a hyper-specific hunting environment. And if you take them out of that hyper-specific environment for that hyper-specific type of animal you're hunting, they end up becoming ineffective. What we've seen is that camouflage has gotten really good for highly specific environments, but camouflage development has been pretty stagnant when it comes to developing sort of the perfect camo for a diverse set of environments. Let me quickly transition to the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. As many of you know, besides doing YouTube, I'm also a clothing designer, and Squarespace is integral to me personally for running my business. I'm able to host all of my products with an online store that I built through Squarespace. Squarespace helps me manage my orders, market to my customers, and be able to easily update my website when new products are launched. Whether you sell physical goods, digital content, or services, Squarespace has the tools you need to start selling online. Getting started with Squarespace is easy. All you have to do is select a professionally designed Squarespace website template with options for every use and category. Then customize your look, update content, and add features to fit your needs. Transform any template into your own and stand out online on every device. So whether my customers are coming from mobile or desktop, I know they're still getting the ideal experience and functionality. Easily launch your website and get discovered fast with integrated optimized SEO tools so you show up to more people more often and grow the way you want. Squarespace makes my life easier with its fast and reliable website hosting and design templates, which makes sure I can focus on the things I need to make sure my business is running successfully. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/KarstenKroning to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Well, that's sort of the history of how we've seen camo develop as a technology over time. Question is, why are we all wearing it today? Camo is basically worn more at this point than any other traditional fabric pattern in clothing. It isn't just worn by military servicemen or hunters, but instead it has this broader cultural and fashion implication. We see camo first really being introduced and becoming popular to civilians in the late 60s, when camo and other military uniforms were sort of worn ironically and hijacked by Vietnam War protesters, otherwise known as part of the hippie subculture. Wearing camo in this context was just really a way of showing that you were part of the hippie movement. Very similarly, at the same time in the 60s and 70s, in Europe and specifically the UK, surplus uniforms were also being adopted by subcultures. While Europe didn't necessarily have an anti-war movement because they weren't tied to the US's war in Vietnam, surplus camo uniforms were often integrated into punk subcultures. A lot of times they would customize them with badges, and some early examples of bands that wore camo with sort of a punk attitude towards it, bands like Throbbing Gristle in the UK. And so while in the US they sort of had this hippie attitude towards camo, camo in the UK or the European context was a bit more edgy, I would say, or had sort of an aggressive countercultural lens towards it. When punk came from Europe and the UK over to the States, you started seeing a lot of other subcultures that were punk adjacent repping and wearing camo, again, especially woodland camo. It didn't become a massive phenomenon until the late 90s or early 2000s, when the streetwear brand Bape blew up camo and made it a highly coveted fashion item. A bathing ape, often also called Bape, was a Japanese streetwear brand that would take these camo patterns and integrate their own logo into the pattern. And Bape would end up exploding in hip-hop culture. The brand would resell for high values, and basically Bape cemented camo as a fashion staple in contemporary culture. Wearing different types of woodland camo specifically became very, very popular as a fashion staple, especially by the 2000s when woodland camo wasn't really being used by the American military. We don't see mimicry camo styles really become popular until the 2020s. Camo styles like mossy oak or real tree really stayed outside of the fashion lens, and then came the rise of workwear style. You saw mimicry styles of camo like mossy oak or real tree becoming more popular in trendier circles, with trendy urban individuals, basically hipsters, who are also wearing a lot of vintage, particularly workwear brands like Carhartt, in places like Silver Lake, Brooklyn, and this is how wearing camo in an Ethel Cain way came about. Which brings us to sort of an interesting point, is that camo is oftentimes worn ironically, or if not worn ironically, has at least cultural origins in being worn ironically. Most people you would see in Silver Lake or Brooklyn have never been hunting, they've never served in the military, they have no practical reason for wearing camo, and oftentimes their own views would directly oppose the views of the person who would wear it for its intended purpose. While I'm sure there are many examples of people who just wear camo because it looks cool or it's trendy, or maybe they have a more nuanced relationship with camo, a lot of people you'll see wearing camo today wear it in sort of this ironic way, where it's meant to sort of directly oppose its intended purpose. Anyways, I hope you guys liked this video. Thanks again for watching, and thanks again for Squarespace for sponsoring it. Again, my name is Karsten Craning, and I will see you guys later.